In the marble corridors of the Whitmore estate, that silence had a name: Margaret Hale. For 11 years, she moved through the house like a whisper, pressing shirts before dawn, setting coffee at precisely 6, vanishing before anyone had reason to notice her. To Charles Whitmore, founder of a technology empire worth billions, she was furniture with a pulse. He had built his fortune on ruthless efficiency, and efficiency, to him, meant never wasting a glance on the help. Charles Whitmore was 68 years old, and by every external measure, he had won 3 companies, a skyline of properties across 4 continents, a name that appeared in headlines more often than in conversation. He had 2 daughters who called on holidays, a rotating staff of assistants who called every hour, and a house so large that entire wings went unused for months at a time. What Charles did not have, what no accountant, no assistant, no daughter had ever managed to give him, was a single person who looked at him without calculating what he was worth. Margaret Hale had worked in that house longer than any of his marriages had lasted. She arrived at 5 each morning, left after the dinner service, and in 11 years, Charles Whitmore had never once asked her a question that wasn't a command. He did not know she had a sister in the city. He did not know her husband had died 9 years earlier, or that she had raised 2 children alone on a housekeeper's wage while grieving in silence. He did not know because he had never asked. To him, she was simply the woman who does the floors. It was late autumn when the storm rolled in, the kind that rattled windows and knocked out power lines across the county. The household staff had gone home early, released ahead of the worst of it. Charles's daughters were traveling. His assistants were unreachable, scattered across time zones. The house, for perhaps the first time in years, was empty except for 2 people. Margaret had stayed behind to finish the evening's work, moving quietly through the east wing with a tray of tea, when she heard a sound no house that size should ever produce: a body meeting the floor. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. She found Charles Whitmore collapsed in his study, his face pale, his breathing shallow and wrong. In the space of a heartbeat, the woman he had never once addressed by name became the only thing standing between him and the end of his life. She called for help with one hand and began compressions with the other. She did not stop counting until paramedics pulled her gently away. She rode beside him in the ambulance, gripping a hand that had never once reached for hers, repeating 4 words like a vow, over and over, into the noise of sirens and rain. "Stay with me, sir. You are not alone." Charles Whitmore spent 3 days unconscious in the intensive care unit. Machines did the breathing his body had briefly forgotten how to do. Word reached his daughters, his board, his attorneys. Flowers arrived. Statements were drafted for the press. But when his eyes finally opened, none of them were in the room. The first face he saw belonged to a woman in a housekeeper's uniform, asleep upright in a hospital chair she had refused to leave for 3 days. Her hands, he would later learn, still bore the faint bruising of compressions performed on a heart that was not her own to save. He did not say anything that day. He simply watched her sleep, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Charles Whitmore felt something close to shame. He was discharged a week later, quieter than the man who had gone in. The staff noticed the change immediately, the way he lingered in doorways, the way he asked, for the first time, "Where is Margaret?" instead of simply expecting her presence. But Margaret was not there. Her room above the garage stood empty. Her uniform was folded neatly on the bed, pressed the way she pressed everything, as though she could not leave, even her resignation in disorder. No note, no forwarding address. Only silence, and a house that suddenly felt far too large without the sound of her footsteps in it. The staff whispered theories. Some said she had taken another position. Some said she had simply had enough, after 11 years of invisibility, of a man who nearly died without knowing her middle name. Charles asked no one directly, but those closest to him said he searched for her in every room he entered, out of habit, for weeks. 7 days after her disappearance, a plain envelope arrived at the small apartment where Margaret Hale had gone to stay with her sister. Inside was a single page, handwritten, not typed by an assistant, not drafted by legal counsel, but written, Margaret would later say, in handwriting she barely recognized as steady. It read, in part, that a man who had spent 4 decades acquiring everything money could buy had finally understood, at 68, that none of it had ever amounted to a heart that cared whether he lived or died. It said that on the night she counted compressions into his chest, she had given him something no contract, no company, and no fortune ever had. It said the house, the entire estate, gate and grounds, and every room she had once polished in silence now belonged to her. Not as payment, as recognition. Thank you, the letter closed, for saving more than my life. The estate that once bore the Whitmore name has since been renamed. Visitors who pass through the front gate today see a different plaque entirely, one bearing the name of a woman who spent 11 years believing no one would ever learn it. Each morning, in the same kitchen where she once pressed shirts before dawn, Margaret Hale still rises before sunrise. She still makes breakfast. But the table she sets now seats 11 children, each one taken in from a system that had overlooked them the way the world had once overlooked her. Charles Whitmore, for his part, was last known to visit twice a month, not as the owner of the house, but as a guest in it. Those who have seen him there say he no longer walks past people without looking at them. Some transformations, it seems, only happen once a person has been forced to see who is standing beside them all along. This has been their story. If this story moved you, subscribe, because the next quiet act of kindness we uncover could be the one that changes everything.